Today, we're diving into one of the most incredible survival stories in the history of aviation. Seriously, it's a story that kicks off like any other flight, but ends with an impossible choice, thousands of feet over the middle of a very dark ocean. Let's get right into it. Just imagine hearing those words at 30,000 feet. It's the middle of the night, and you're surrounded by nothing but the Atlantic Ocean. This was the chilling reality for the crew of Air Transat Flight 236, a message from the first officer right at the peak of the crisis. So, to really understand how they got to this terrifying point, we have to rewind, right back to the beginning. So, let's set the scene. It's August 23rd, 2001. We're talking about a routine red-eye flight from Toronto, Canada, headed for Lisbon, Portugal. I mean, this is a journey that thousands of people take every single day without a second thought. And on board this particular flight were 306 souls. Families coming back from vacation, people on business trips, kids, and of course the crew. That's 306 lives, all completely oblivious to the absolute drama that was about to unfold. When you look at the pre-flight status, it's almost unbelievable how perfect everything seemed. The plane itself, a state-of-the-art Airbus A330. All the systems were green. The weather was beautiful, clear skies all the way. The fuel tanks were topped off, and passengers were just settling in for a long, uneventful flight. Everything was, it was dangerously normal. You see, what nobody knew, what nobody could know, was that a tiny, microscopic crack in a fuel line, something left over from a maintenance error weeks earlier, was silently getting worse, stressed out by the high pressures of flight. A tiny, tiny flaw, about to cause a total, catastrophic failure. So how in the world did this tiny crack turn into a full-blown crisis? Well, the invisible countdown really started about 4 hours into the flight, as the plane was cruising peacefully over that vast, empty Atlantic, and that's when the first little sign of trouble popped up. It all began with a single warning light: fuel imbalance. Now, the pilots, pretty reasonably, thought it was probably just a faulty sensor, which was a known quirk on these planes. So they did exactly what their training manual told them to do for that exact warning. They made a decision that on literally any other day would have been the right call. But on this day, it was the worst possible move. What they did was they opened something called the crossfeed valve. Its job is pretty simple. If you've got too much fuel in one wing's tank, you open this valve and it lets the fuel flow over to the other wing's tank. It balances the plane. It's a standard, textbook procedure. But here's the problem. The plane didn't have a fuel imbalance, it had a fuel leak. So by opening that valve, they accidentally started feeding all the fuel from the good tank directly into the broken line of the leaking tank. They were, without knowing it, pumping their entire fuel supply out into the night sky over the Atlantic. This just created a terrifying disconnect, right? In the cockpit, the pilots are looking at these confusing digital gauges that are screaming simple senso error. But the physical reality, completely invisible to them, was that their plane was literally bleeding out its lifeblood, minute by agonizing minute. And then they got the warning that no pilot ever wants to see, especially over an ocean: fuel quantity low. This wasn't a glitch anymore. This was a real, undeniable, unfolding disaster. They declared an emergency immediately and started diverting towards the closest piece of land they could find, Lodge's airbase in the Azores Islands. But it was too late. That invisible countdown had just hit 0. And over the dark, cold expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, the unthinkable happened. First, the right engine sputtered out and died. The massive plane just shuddered as one of its giant power sources went completely silent, turning into dead weight. The pilots were fighting just to keep control. Just a few minutes later, the left engine did the same. And with that, an eerie, terrifying silence fell over the entire aircraft. There was no engine hum anymore, just the sound of wind rushing past the fuselage. Flight 236 was now completely powerless. Think about this for a second. A 200-ton machine filled with 306 people had just become the world's largest, heaviest, and most terrifyingly sophisticated glider. What happened next was, and I am not exaggerating, one of the most remarkable feats of pure skill and airmanship in modern history. An unpowered glide, in the dark, towards a tiny island they couldn't even see. Okay, so let's just break down their new reality. They have zero thrust. The only thing keeping the lights on in the cockpit and giving them a little bit of hydraulic pressure for the controls is this tiny emergency propeller called a ram air turbine, which thankfully deployed automatically. And their only hope, their only one, is a single runway on a tiny volcanic island somewhere out there in the ocean. Everything now, every decision, every second, it all came down to a single number, the plane's glide ratio. For an Airbus A330, that number is roughly 12-1. So what does a 12-1 glide ratio actually mean? Well, it's a simple, brutal equation. It means for every 12 kilometers they fly forward, they are going to lose 1 kilometer in altitude. The plane is in a constant, unchangeable descent. It's a race against gravity, and they're trading precious altitude for distance, knowing they only have so much altitude to spend. And here's the kicker. The distance they still had to cover was a staggering 120 kilometers. When they did the math, it seemed completely impossible. The calculations showed they would hit the water long before they ever reached the island. Can you just imagine the contrast? In the cockpit, you have Captain Robert Pichet and his first officer, Dirk de Jager, in a state of extreme, almost surreal focus, flying this giant glider with millimeter precision. But back in the cabin, the lights are dim, the engine noise is gone, and people are starting to realize just how serious this is. There was just darkness, silence, and prayer. But through sheer skill and just perfect descent management, they did the impossible. For 36 agonizing minutes, they glided in total silence. It's the longest unpowered flight of a passenger jet in history. And then, a string of lights. The runway appeared through the windscreen. They had made it to the island. But the challenge wasn't over. They still had to land this massive, unpowered brick. They came in way too fast and too high. They had limited controls and absolutely no engine reverse to slow them down. The plane hit the runway hard, it bounced, and the tires blew out from the emergency braking. But it held together. It skidded down that runway and finally came to a stop. And against all odds, every single one of the 306 people on board survived. So what do you even take away from a story like this? It starts with a tiny mechanical flaw, right? Then it gets way worse because of a human decision that was, by the book, totally correct. And yet it ends with this act of incredible human skill that saved everyone. It really makes you wonder, where is that line between a complete disaster and an absolute miracle?